As you all, as you all come into the room, we'd love for you to type in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. And how about let us know if you have returned to school, if you work in the school. I know we start tomorrow. Our students will return tomorrow. We're really excited to have them back in the building. All right, thank you. Oh, we've got North Carolina join us. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. As you all type that, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kelsey Noel, and I'm honored to serve as the current president of the Virginia chapter of the Reading League. Our chapter is made up of dedicated leaders in literacy from across the Commonwealth. So thank you so much for being one of those leaders and joining us tonight. We know that many districts have either returned or are gearing up to start the school year. And we also know how overwhelming that this time can be. So we truly appreciate you spending your evening with us. Our board currently consists of our past president and governance chair, Jennifer Sassano, our vice president, Aaron Saxon, our secretary, Brandy Marola, our treasurer, Jacqueline Alston, our events chair, Diane Fleming, our publicity co-chairs, Ann Bragg and Lakeisha McCoy, our membership chair, Angie White, and our advancement chair, Carrie Phillips. Without these amazing women and leaders in literacy, we wouldn't be able to put events like this on today. So together we are committed to advancing evidence-aligned reading instruction throughout Virginia, and we're glad that you're here with us tonight. As the Reading League Virginia, we aspire to ensure that every educator is prepared to implement evidence-aligned practices to meet the diverse profiles of all students with the goal of becoming skilled lifelong learners. Our mission is to advance the awareness and understanding and use of evidence-aligned reading instruction. So, in that spirit, we are more than thrilled to welcome Dr. Laura Tortorelli, who brings deep expertise and insight to this important work. Dr. Laura Tortorelli is an associate professor of elementary literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. Dr. Tortorelli's research focuses on texts, technologies, and evidence-based practices that teachers use for reading and writing instruction. She also teaches future teachers how to teach reading in Michigan State's #1 ranked elementary education program. Her work has been funded by the Institute for Education Sciences, the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund, along with the International Literacy Association. Her current projects focus on supporting informational text reading and writing in 4th and 5th grade and integrating AI into early reading instruction. On that note, it is my absolute pleasure to warmly welcome and thank Dr. Laura Tortorelli for joining us this evening.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I went, let me get it started. I feel like I'm returning home because I lived in Virginia, and I know that a lot of you are not from Virginia. I'm seeing in the chat that you're from all over. I attended UVA for both undergrad and got my PhD in reading education there. And my roommate was from Burke, Virginia. I know we have at least one person from Burke, Virginia. So that is exciting for me to sort of be returning. I'm going to talk today about some of the research I've done since I left Virginia. But while I was in Virginia, I worked with Marcia Vernizzi and Mike McKenna, for those of you who've been around for a long time and remember them. I worked on the PALS database and everything else. So I go way back, and I've been really excited to see all of the improvements to reading instruction, and how I really see Virginia as being one of the leaders in the science of reading movement, and I know the Reading League partnership has been a big part of that. So I have been at Michigan State now for 10 years. So been doing a lot of research since then, and I'm excited to share some of that work with you today, including things that I work with my pre-service with teachers on, and some of the research projects I've been on. So I'm going to start with like a little overview of the science of reading as I see it, some of the key theories and some of the key theories and concepts that underline my work, particularly about the development of reading proficiency in elementary grades. What I see as the goal that we have for kids to make sure that they enter their secondary grades ready to learn from content area texts. Then I'm going to talk about assessment and the different types of assessments and what we can actually learn about kids from them to inform our instruction. And then I'm going to share a little bit about a recent project I did where I tried to embody those principles of assessment and really use data to understand more about a particular phenomenon that I've noticed in my research. So I'm going to start with the science of reading, how reading develops from K5. I know a lot of you have a lot of background knowledge in this already, but so it's really about getting us on the same page and thinking about what it is we're talking about when we're talking about reading development. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the simple view of reading. Yes, you can respond in the chat, thumbs up. So the simple view of reading is basically an equation that tells us how we can predict how well an individual child can comprehend what they are reading. And basically, it is, I guess, lots of thumbs up. Excellent. So basically, why this is important is because it is a product model, right? We have to look at both a child's decoding level and the level of the linguistic comprehension to predict their reading comprehension. And if either one is 0, then reading comprehension will be 0. These are both areas of skill that we need to develop. And sometimes my pre-service teachers sort of misunderstand this. They think that because decoding comes first, that means it's more important, or because that means it needs to be developed first, or that these two things need to be developed separately. And that's not true. What this model tells us is that they're both important. However, today I'm only going to be talking about the decoding side because that's where most of my research focuses. But I wanted to first of all acknowledge that both are equally important, and I can't possibly talk about the assessment of every aspect of reading comprehension, but they're both really important and we can't leave anything out. And I think part of what the discussion we've been having that's been really productive as a nation is about this decoding side and what are evidence-based practices for teaching that. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the way we measure decoding and the best way to predict reading comprehension changes very rapidly across the elementary grades. So Kate Kane and the Reading Research Consortium did a fabulous study where they basically studied how the simple view of reading changes over time. And so they looked at the best ways to measure both decoding and linguistic comprehension in first grade, second grade, and third grade, and what is the best predictor of reading comprehension on that decoding side of the equation in each of those grades. And basically what they found was that in first grade, decoding is what we typically think about when we think about decoding. The best measure of reading comprehension is how well you can recognize words on the page. In fact, just in isolated word recognition is the best predictor of reading comprehension at the first grade level. But by second grade, those two things have already evened out. Linguistic comprehension and decoding are equal predictors of reading comprehension. And then by third grade, measures of reading fluency have replaced measures of isolated word recognition as the best way to predict the best component of that equation for predicting reading comprehension. So when we're talking about the decoding thing inside of that equation, it changes really rapidly across the elementary grades. In the first grade, we're trying to just get kids to read words. In second grade, we're trying to get them to read words and integrate those words into their reading comprehension. And by third grade, we really want them to be reading fluently. And the way this develops is through a process called orthographic mapping. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this as well. This is Linnea Airey's concept for how phonics knowledge turns into automatic word recognition. And basically the idea is that we don't just teach kids phonics for the sake of learning phonics, and we don't just teach them to decode words for the sake of decoding words well. We teach them because to use phonics knowledge to orthographically map new words that they encounter in text. So when they encounter a word in text for the first time, they don't just sound it out, but actually they map the sounds in the words, the individual phonemes that they can hear in the words, to the letter or letter patterns that represent those sounds. And that is different for every specific word. So in the word cat, they have to figure out that k is represented by C and not K, that a is represented by A, and that t is represented by T. And this is true for words that have, in the word rock, however, when they come to that k sound, they have to figure out that that k sound is actually represented by C and K together. And this is true for irregular words too, like the word said, where they need to figure out that AI is actually representing the eh sound in that word. Basically, every word in the English language needs to go through this mapping process, which is why reading development in English takes several years to get to that fluent level. And the important thing about this mapping process is that by mapping those letters and sounds together, you're able to retain those words in memory. And for Fetty and Hart, lexical quality hypothesis explains why this is important for comprehension. When words are stored in memory, they have multiple identities. And what we're trying to help kids do is pull all those identities together and store them in memory so that when they see the word on the page, they're able to automatically recognize it. So they see the spelling, R-O-C-K. They understand what the phonetic representation of that word is, rock. And then they are able to access all the different things that word can mean and figure out which meaning is appropriate and use that, figure out what, and use that for making sense of what they're reading. And basically what we are doing over the course of these early grades is building reading fluency by building that word recognition and automaticity. So when kids are first reading, every time they encounter a word, they have to slow down. They have to decode it. They have to map the letters and sounds. They have to match it to a word that they know in memory and make sense of that word, right? It's a long, slow process. And they basically are dividing their attentional resources between that decoding and orthographic mapping process and comprehension. But over time, as they have completed that process for more and more and more words, those words are automatically recognized because they've stored them in memory. And that means that they have fewer decoding resources that they have to devote to comprehension, and more of those attentional resources can be, fewer resources that they have to devote to decoding, and more resources can be reallocated to comprehension. And that's what fluent reading is, basically. We want kids to read fluently, not because we want them to do well on a test, although we'll talk about that later, but because we want them to be able to get engaged in what they're reading and not have to spend a bunch of time figuring out the words on the page. And that's really the ultimate goal, in my mind, of elementary reading instruction, is getting kids to this point where they can curl up with a book and get lost in it because word recognition is no longer an obstacle. So Linnea area also has phases of word recognition that it describes really nicely how kids develop into those automatic readers. They start out with that in the pre-alphabetic phase where they don't understand the relationship between letters and sounds. Then they're in a partial alphabetic phase where they're using some letter sound correspondences, but they're fairly inaccurate and irregular. They may just look at the first letter of a word and guess and that kind of thing. So by developing their full phonemic awareness and alphabet knowledge, we can move them along into the full alphabetic stage where they can really start doing that orthographic mapping. And that's when they can make a lot of progress. Then as they develop, once they have mastered that letter by letter correspondence and have a lexicon of a fairly large lexicon of known words, they move into the consolidated alphabetic phase where they can use what they know about written words, their lexicon, to figure out other words. So they can start to use bigger pieces of words like prefixes and suffixes, syllable patterns, and that kind of thing to read longer words. And they can also read words by analogy. And then once they have mastered those more sophisticated word recognition strategies and have applied those to millions and millions of words, they become automatic readers. So how can literacy assessment help kids get to that point where they are automatic and fluent readers by the end of elementary school? A little bit about my background when I was at UVA, and also I lived in Culpeper, Virginia for a while. I don't know if you're familiar with that place, but I studied and was focused primarily on early literacy, right? How do we get kids started reading, kids in that pre-alphabetic and partial alphabetic? How do we get them in that full alphabetic phase? That was really the focus of my work. But recently, I've become more interested in the full range of skills and what kids need to get from full alphabetic to consolidated alphabetic and beyond. And literacy assessment is a big part of how we figure out where kids are in this continuum of development so that we can support them. And there are different types of assessment, and I find that my pre-service teachers and sometimes even my in-service teachers have get overwhelmed by the number of assessments that they're supposed to give, and don't really know what they're supposed to be taking away from this. They don't see the purpose or necessarily how these can help them do their jobs better. And so I'm not here to like sell you on any particular assessment or tell you which assessments your school should use, because I know that's usually out of your control anyway. But really to think about what the available assessments can tell you and are designed to tell you. So we're going to do a little crash course in all the different types of assessments, and then we're going to dig in, look at some familiar assessment, some commonly used assessments, and figure out what they can and can't help you figure out. So first of all, there are different purposes of assessment. And primarily what we're going to be talking about today are formative assessments. And these are ones that you're administering before or sometimes during instruction if you're using like a progress monitoring assessment. It's used to identify instructional needs and make instructional decisions about what kids should do next. That's the kind that's really helpful for you in your job. um, and that's different than what kids usually think of as a test, right? A test is a summative assessment that's usually administered after instruction is completed to see whether or not it worked, right? To see whether goals have been met, if kids have mastered standards, that kind of thing. And kids usually, anytime you sit down with a kid to assess them, they assume they're having a test and that they're supposed to know all the answers, right? And so something that's really helpful is to set the stage for using formative assessments with your children, helping them understand that you're not supposed to know everything. I want to know what you know so that I can help you better. But I'm actually going to be asking you about things I haven't taught you yet, and you're not expected to know that, and that's okay. Sometimes summative assessments can often be what we think of as standardized tests and used for accountability purposes. So here in Michigan, we have the M-STEP. In Virginia, is it still the SOL? Yeah, I've always thought that's a funny acronym. But yeah, the SOL. And that's considered to be that's considered to be what we think of as assessment. But that's just one type of assessment that's used mostly to understand how a given area is doing, right? Like it's used to assess people, basically whole schools and whole states. It's really not used to make individual decisions about children. And so they're really quite different assessments, even though we kind of put them all in the same category. There's also different purposes that you can use formative assessments for. One is screening, and these are what we think as like quick and simple measures, usually things you do at the beginning of the year, or with kids that have just started at the school. And they need to be things that are easy to administer very quickly and can provide an indication of who is just doing well and who might need some extra help, right? So these are things that are kind of what I think of as sorting assessments almost. And and once you have kids that are doing well, you can go more in depth with them, but you also absolutely want to go more in depth with kids that seem to have some needs or be struggling with the screening assessments. And that's where you go to a diagnostic test. And that's typically something you would want to do one-on-one. It would be a little bit more in depth, and it would have some more specific information about the types of skills that kids have mastered and things that they might have weaknesses in or need some additional instruction in. There can also be a kind of diagnostic assessment that's used to diagnose like specific conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, and that kind of thing. That's not really the kind of thing we're talking about today, because that's something that would need to be used by a highly trained professional. This is more diagnostic in your classroom to diagnose problems that kids might be having and try to help them address those problems. And then there are both formal and informal assessments. Formal assessments just mean that it's already written for you, right? There's maybe a little script telling you how to do it. The items are already set. The scoring is already set. You don't have to make an answer key. It's already made. And usually these have been developed and tested by researchers or by curriculum developers. And they're often sold commercially, or sometimes they're available for free. But these types of assessments are what we think of as like the gold standard assessments, because they've gone through that testing and iteration to develop their quality indicators, which we'll talk about in a minute. Whereas informal assessments, and what I find is that teachers often prefer informal assessments. Formal assessments have been created for you. They're all ready to go. Why do you think teachers often prefer informal assessments? Why do you, if you prefer formal assessments? Mhm. Mhm. Any thoughts about that in the chat? Mhm. No? Well, so my understanding is that, oh, here we go. We're getting some responses here. Mhm. hmm hmm Absolutely. So this is exactly what the teachers I work with say. They feel like formal assessments are good because they don't have to be created and they're tested, right? But informal assessments are more easy to interpret, less intimidating. They seem more related to the instructional goals, right? You can actually align them with what you're planning to do, and that can inform you. So I think that I often find teachers who know that they have to collect all this informal assessment data. It's required by their school, but they don't really feel like it's helpful. So then they also spend all this time collecting informal data, and things like, I have teachers who are here in Michigan who are really reluctant to give up doing like running records or even like full reading inventories, even though those take a really long time because they feel like they need more information about what their kids are doing. And I think that I'm hopeful that one of the things you'll take away today is the idea that that you can get information from your formal assessments, that there's actually quite a bit you can learn from them. It's just harder to kind of dig a little bit deeper and figure out what that is. That's not to say informal assessments are bad, but sometimes they take up a lot of time and they really can contribute to that, to teacher burnout if teachers feel like they have to administer all the formal assessments and then all the informal assessments to support their instruction. Um, Sorry, let's keep going. And then there's two different types of scoring that is usually associated with formal assessments. One is norm reference, and that's comparing kids to other kids, right? So that when you see a percentile score, that's telling you how well a kid does on that test compared to other kids. Now, what is that helpful for informing your instruction? Not really, right? This is more helpful as a screening mechanism. If you see that a kid is way, way, way behind where a fourth grader typically is, that might be a reason to look a little bit deeper. What usually more helpful are criterion referenced assessments. And this is what compares kids to specific things that you want them to learn so that you can see what they're doing well at and need to support them in. And then finally, we want to think about our quality indicators. The reason that we want to use formal assessment data when we have it and when we can, even though it's a little bit harder to interpret, is that reliability and validity are really key to the assessment process. And most formal assessments have been studied for reliability and validity. So reliability is how well, the degree to which your test is measuring is consistent from time to time. Like if you give this test to all the kids in your class, will it consistently measure their reading ability? That's something that can only really be established by giving the test to hundreds of kids and finding out by doing statistical analysis. And same thing with validity, right? You as a teacher can come up with questions that you think are getting at reading comprehension, and they might be inadvertently assessing baseball knowledge, because you as a teacher, you don't, that's not your job to create assessments. And so figuring out if the assessment accurately measures the thing it's supposed to measure without conflating with other constructs is what we call validity. And that's a really important thing to have as well. And so this is a reason to consider using that formal data when you have it available to you. However, it's not that easy because every assessment that you have in your classroom is a different combination of all these categories of things that we've been discussing, right? And so I usually teach my teachers to use 4 principles for using assessment data and making sure that they can get the most out of the data that they're collecting about their students and use it to inform their instruction. The first is to evaluate the test and the task. Really dig in and see what it is testing and what it can tell you about a kid. The second is to compare across sources of data. If you look across multiple assessments, you can learn a lot more than if you just look at one data assessment at a time. There's usually a pattern that you can see that will help you understand that child better. The third is to interpret the data in terms of literacy development. All of those theories and stages that we were talking about, go back to what you know about literacy development and figure out where this data can tell you that child is on that continuum. And then finally, identify evidence-based practices to address the needs that you've found through assessment. So I've been talking for a little bit, so we're going to do a little bit of chat discussion. We're going to look at some commonly used assessments. These are all formal assessments that you can that you can get and you can administer to your students. And they're all formative. They're designed to help you figure out what instruction kids need. So these are not, this is not M-step questions or, NAEP questions or anything like that. And they're all focused on various aspects of automatic word recognition. And we don't have time to talk about all of these questions, but these are the kinds of questions that you'll want to ask when you're using the assessment data in your classroom. In the evaluate, compare, interpret, and identify. So for each of these questions, each of these assessments, let's talk about the task. What is it that this assessment is actually asking students to do? Then think about what it doesn't tell you. What other data would I need? And then what are the evidence-based practices that could address these needs? So let's start with, oh, I forgot to make the questions we're answering red and everyone. I'm sorry. I'll try to do it, but so let's start with the past. Has anyone ever given, you can respond in the chat here. Has anyone ever given this assessment? Phonological awareness and screening test? Yeah, excellent. So this is a test that has, reliability and validity statistics. It tests different levels of phonemic awareness. So take a look at this, just the first couple of items here. And if you've given it, you have more in-depth knowledge. What is the task? What does this assessment ask children to do? And you can respond in the chat. But you can also see the first couple of items here in the slide. It's about the syllable level. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Phonemic manipulation, absolutely. Is there any written material that you show the children, or is it all oral? Yes, all oral phonemic manipulation. So to understand what kids need, what other data would you need? What else would you want to know about a child other than their phonemic manipulation? Decoding and spelling, automaticity, oral reading fluency, decoding, absolutely. So one of the things that can trip you up when you're finding graph and correspondences, exactly. So what this test does, it helps you figure out if children are having difficulty isolating particular phonemes, particularly types of phonemes, right? Like there's the basic syllable subtest, there's the onset rhyme, there's basic phoneme, and then there's advanced phoneme manipulation. It can help you figure out if they're having trouble with that. If they're having trouble with that, they are going to have some trouble with transitioning into that full alphabetic stage, right? If they can't hear all the sounds in the words, they're going to have a hard time orthographically mapping letters and sounds onto those words. However, as all of you have pointed out, it's not enough to just know if their phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is good or not. If it's good or bad, you still need to know what their letter sound knowledge is, what their phonics knowledge is, and how well they're going to be able to integrate those skills. So one thing that can happen is that if you only have, if you have one assessment or one assessment that you're assigned to use, every kid can, like, it's sort of like the hammer and the nail problem, right? The evidence-based practices that can address these needs, well, we don't know, right? We don't know because we don't have that complete picture. We would need that alphabet assessment. So it's really tempting if you have screening data from something like this to just do a bunch of oral phoneme manipulation. But in fact, the evidence-based practices indicated we want to integrate that with our alphabet knowledge as soon as possible, right? So we wouldn't, even though it's really, really helpful from an assessment perspective to know if they're having trouble isolating phonemes, if you're going to do Alconen boxes, if you're going to do some sort of practice manipulating those phonemes, segmenting and blending, you're going to want to bring letters into that practice as soon as possible. And so this last question is, I think, one of the most important, because assessments, if we think about them too simplistically, can lead us astray. We're like, oh, we'll just fix this phoneme problem, and then we'll fix the reading problem. But in fact, you got to look at all the different, you have to compare and contrast across assessments, and you also have to think about what does the evidence say helps kids get better at phonemic awareness? Well, part of what helps them get better at phonemic awareness is learning to read, right? Being able to manipulate letters makes you better at phonemic awareness tasks and makes you better at all literacy tasks. So that's the first example. Let's go on to another common assessment, the Fry sight word checklist. Does anybody use this? Mhm. Mhm. All right. So what is the ta have in the past? Good. Okay. A lot of people have used it in the past, so you're familiar with this. What is this asking kids to do? Mhm. Sight words. Hmm. Yeah. Mhm. Read, oh, I like that, Holly. Read words that they may have memorized, right? So the idea is that this a lot asks kids to read a bunch of words that are highly frequent in texts, right? So that word sight word is a little bit of a misnomer, but basically words that are that they may have encountered in texts. Or may have encountered in sight word instruction or high frequency word instruction. It doesn't actually tell you how they learned those words, right? It doesn't tell you if they've orthographically mapped them or if they have just memorized them, as Holly points out. So it tells you some things that are helpful, like is it helpful to like it's helpful if they can recognize the word at that will help them read, but it doesn't actually tell you if they know the phoneme correspondences. So I'm sure what you're going to say when I say what other data do I need is exactly the same thing you said about the past, right? We need that decoding and phonemic awareness and fluency data. So this helps you understand they can help you understand which high frequency words they may struggle with in text. It can help you understand if you have a high frequency word instructional program, which words you might want to target. But it can't actually tell you whether or not they're reading. And that's a mistake that parents make oftentimes. They think, oh, they can read all these words, they're reading. But it doesn't actually tell you whether they're in that partial alphabetic, full alphabetic, or what they're able to do with new words that they encounter in text. So when we think about this, again, a trap that teachers and more often I see parents fall into is they're like, oh, they don't know all the first 100 sight words, time to get out the flashcards, right? But the evidence-based practices for teaching these high frequency words include practices that support orthographic mapping, including those irregular sound correspondences and teaching them explicitly, and just opportunities to read and write, right? I often say, we don't need to spend a ton of time on high frequency words in isolation because they show up in every text that kids might want to read, right? Every decodable text has high frequency words. Everything that kids want to write has high frequency words. So there's lots of opportunities to use them because they are high frequency. So the evidence-based practices don't need to address high frequency words specifically. They're the same practices we're going to use for all of other reading and writing and spelling instruction. How many of you have used the informal decoding inventory, the IDI? This is Sharon Walpole's measure. Does anyone use this? I'm not. Okay. All right. If you haven't, take a look at this. There's many subtests here. This is just the very first subtest. Mhm. What does this actually test? What are we asking kids to do? Mm-hmm. Decode words, absolutely. Yeah, it's a decoding test. It's called informal. It has been validated though, so and it has actually, and it's so it's I would say that it's not that informal at this point. It asks kids to decode both real and nonsense words that have, and it's very diagnostic because it's broken up into specific phonics patterns. So it aligns really well with Sharon Walpole's differentiated reading instruction small group program, but it also is helpful with really any phonics program because it lets you know how well kids are doing with both real words and nonsense words. The nonsense words give you an insight into how kids process new words that they haven't seen before, right? Because they may have seen the word hit before, they may have read the word met before. And so sometimes that doesn't all, so that can tell you how well they're reading words, but not tell you necessarily what they do when they come to a new word. And what kids do when they come to new words is, of course, the whole ball game as far as orthographic mapping. So basically, there are subtests across this inventory that tell you how kids read words, real words and non-words. What other data would you want about these kids? Mhm. Yep. Absolutely. That's what we're going to do next. Orphan spelling. Absolutely. How are they able to are they able to use these patterns in a more in context, and are they able to use them to spell as well as to read? Spelling data usually lags reading data a little bit. So I don't recommend going the other way from spelling to reading, but from reading to spelling is a really helpful additional measure. So one of the things that can be really tricky about this type of data is that it does give you insight into what they're going to do when they come across new words, but you don't want to spend a bunch of time on nonsense words. Nonsense words are a great assessment tool, but there's not a lot of evidence that shows that teaching nonsense words is a good use of your time. So that's one of the ways that this kind of assessment can be tricky in that way. And then finally, we've got ORF. ORF is a little bit different. You've mentioned ORF every time. ORF is a little bit different than these other ones. This is really what I consider to be a screening assessment. It's also one of the only norm reference assessments. Rather than looking at the criteria, what we're doing is seeing how quickly and accurately kids can read compared to other kids their age, right? And so Dibble's ORF is a great assessment because it lets you know if they're on track or not, but it's actually the least diagnostic of the ones that we've talked about because if they're not reading fast, there are absolutely repeated reading strategies and other things you can do. But some of my research and other people's research has shown that if they have fundamental underlying word problems, like just, repeated reading isn't going to be enough, right? We actually want to encourage kids to slow down and orthographically map new words that they come across in the text. We don't want to encourage them to just keep reading faster and faster. So if you have a kid who's struggling with ORF or is not meeting benchmarks on ORF, that's really good information to have, but you also need the other underlying data to figure out what to do about it. So that's just a basic that's just an exercise in digging a little bit deeper into your assessments and thinking about what they can tell you and what they can't tell you. And what I wanted to share now was a little bit how I applied some of these principles to address in one of my recent research studies to address and get this issue of the decoding threshold. How many people are familiar with the decoding threshold research? Mhm. I'm trying to figure out if this is a new thing or not, but I'll go ahead. Not familiar? Okay. At least one person says this is new. Good. Somewhat. Okay, good, good. Okay. I'm not telling you only things you know. That's wonderful. So the decoding threshold is something that was established by researchers at the Educational Testing Service. They have a lot of data available to them. Those are the people who administer the SAT as well as many other high quality assessments. And so basically they are able to look across grade levels at thousands of kids nationally and what they identified in that data was that there is a threshold that they called the decoding threshold. That if by the end of fifth grade, kids didn't meet this criterion in decoding and word recognition, they didn't experience any growth in comprehension in the subsequent years. So like sixth grade and up, comprehension just flatlined on their assessments. And students below, they also did follow-up studies that showed that students below the decoding threshold spend less time attempting to read unfamiliar words. That's why that nonsense word recognition task is interesting and informative because it lets us know what kids do when they come across unfamiliar words. And they've actually replicated this finding, both of these findings in a follow-up study. So there have been now a series of studies that have identified this decoding threshold as a bottleneck for future reading comprehension. And in their most recent study, they estimated that 1 in 4 fifth grade students in the nation are not meeting this threshold. So that's quite a few. And so this is really interesting research. But it's based on a very standardized, very formal test, which I'll show you in a minute. So I would tell teachers about this, and then they would get very worried, and they would want to know, well, what do we do? What does that mean? What is the decoding threshold? So I decided to use and one of the main questions was, where does that occur, right? Is the decoding threshold really decoding and what we think of as as decoding work and phonics work at, at that first grade level where they are learning how to decode single syllable words? Or is it a little bit more sophisticated? Do these kids need to go all the way back and have like basic phonics intervention, or do they need something else? And basically, when we think about the way texts increase in complexity over the course of the elementary grades, we know they start with these single syllable words, and then they start to need to read more two syllable words even by the end of first grade. And then by fourth and fifth grade, these are the types of words that students in my projects are having trouble reading within their social studies and science texts. So we basically needed to figure out where these kids were in order to address their instructional needs. Fortunately, I was part of a research study at this time that was collecting data on fourth and fifth graders post-COVID, because kids had a lot of instructional gaps in their foundational skills. And so they were coming into fourth and fifth grade and having trouble reading science and social studies texts. And so I decided that we would do a little side project to evaluate what this actually means. So we're going to follow the 4 steps that I laid out. We're going to start by evaluating the assessment and trying to figure out what it's actually asking kids to do. So first of all, as far as quality indicators, reliability, validity, there's a ton of research on this assessment. It was developed as part of an IES funded grant. It's been part of ETS for years. It's a very high quality assessment as far as those types of indicators. There's thousands of pages of technical documentation. That's not an issue. But what teachers get when they administer this assessment is a score, right? It's like, I think 235 is the decoding threshold score. Well, what does 235 on word recognition and decoding really mean? So we need to look more deeply at what the test actually tests. And basically what this word recognition and decoding subtest asks you to do is distinguish between real words, nonsense words, and this category of words that I think is really interesting called a pseudo-homophone. So a word that sounds like a real word, but isn't actually a real word. And so here's an example of what one of the items is. There's a word, and kids have to choose, is this a real word? Is it not a real word? Or does it sound exactly like a real word? So what's the answer for this first word? Real word, not real word? Sounds like a real word. It's a real word, yeah. How about this one? Not a real word. How about this one? Ah, yeah. Sounds exactly like a real word, right? So there's 3 options. It's not one or the other. And so basically, it's a really clever task because it's asking kids to actually engage with words, whether or not they recognize them automatically. So if they recognize a word automatically, they know it's a real word. But if it's not a word they recognize automatically, they have to go through the orthographic mapping process and phonologically recode it, and then think about whether or not it matches a word in their oral vocabulary and make a decision about whether or not it's not a real word or it sounds exactly like a real word. So this is not decoding by itself, right? This is more complex than what we usually think of as decoding. So we know that already. Then step 2 is that we want to compare how kids do on this assessment to how they do on other more assessments that are a little bit more transparent or a little bit more familiar to us. Because I was part of a research study, we were already collecting a ton of other data about these students, including the multisyllabic decoding inventory, which is an extension of the Walpole inventory that I showed you earlier that goes into 2-syllable words and looks at across different syllable types. The test of word reading efficiency, or the Tower, the Dibbles-Orff task, the test of silent reading efficiency and comprehension, and the motivation to read nonfiction profile. So these are all standardized measures, but they all tell us different things about kids reading. So I was interested in looking at kids above and below the decoding threshold and seeing how they did on these other measures so we could understand what this is actually telling us. I should say that these were just the example items. The actual items get harder. They're not all single syllable words. So here's the multisyllabic decoding inventory for those of you who haven't seen it before. It's the same structure as the IDI, but it goes across the different syllable types and also includes compound words. And for every subtest, there are 10 items that are real words and 10 items that are nonsense words that follow the same patterns. So, and here's my sample. We were working with one large urban school in the Northeast that was very racially diverse and fairly socioeconomically disadvantaged. And if you look at their their descriptive statistics on these tests, you'll see that the normative data over here in the percentile indicates that this population as a whole was not a strong reading population, right? They're in the bottom 10 percentile on the Read Basics CAPT word recognition test, which establishes the decoding threshold. But they're also in the bottom 13 to 25% on all the standardized measures. So we know that this is a population that is not performing particularly highly on standardized measures of reading, and we can learn a lot from. So there are going to be some kids that are above and below that decoding threshold. And in fact, it was about 50-50. About 50% of them were above it, and 50% of them were below it. And so that gave us an opportunity to compare kids above and below the decoding threshold on all these other measures. And they were significantly different across every measure, of course, because these are all measures of decoding. But what was really interesting is that they were actually quite good at reading two-syllable words. The whole sample read 85% of the two-syllable words correctly. So these are not kids who are struggling with multisyllabic words in a general way. And you'll see that even the kids below the decoding threshold could read almost all the compound words, could read 80% of the words with closed first syllables, could read 80% of the words with common vowel teams or the consonant LE at the back. They were actually doing pretty well on most of these words. So there were differences between the kids above and below the decoding threshold, but they aren't differences that indicate huge chasms in word recognition. The biggest gaps were in these open first syllable. Those are words that you have to do vowel flexing with to figure out which vowel sound to use. And then also in these that consonant silent E pattern at the end of words really threw them off. Even though they were able to recognize that in single syllable words, they weren't always able to recognize it in multisyllabic words. And the same thing with the non-words. Everybody did worse on the non-words. But the biggest gaps were these consonant and vowel E patterns and the open first syllables. Compound words, whether real or fake, are not a problem for any of these kids. So that was a really interesting thing to learn. And if you look at the actual items ranked by difficulty, you can see that there's no difference in how well kids are doing on these fairly familiar two-syllable words, especially compound words. And there's a huge gap that opens up between the kids above and below the decoding threshold that then closes when we get to the hardest words. And so basically there's a zone of words that are challenging for kids below the decoding threshold and not for kids above. And here are the words that had the biggest differences between these two populations: flannel, lotus, spiny, rely, endure, cascade, recline, diner, and ointment. And you can't quite see all of the items because there's 140, there's not 140, there's 70 real word items. So it's not really, the points don't exactly line up with the words. But what do you think is interesting about those words? Or what do you think could indicate what those words might have in common? Any ideas? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Schwa sounds. Excellent. Great suggestion. Anything else? Absolutely. Any sort of, Martina, you're right. Any sort of word that had a, what's the word? Ambiguous vowel sound was very challenging for kids below the decoding threshold. Anything else that you notice about these? Open for syllable. Absolutely. These are also the highest age of acquisition words, which is a fancy way of saying the most difficult vocabulary words on the assessment. And so if we think, so that's another, so there are parts that are, yep, absolutely, Patty. Vocabulary knowledge is something that they needed to figure out if they. So if you think about words with open first syllables or schwa sounds or ambiguous sounds, what you need to resolve those and figure out if it's recline or recline, or recline or recline. All right, is that you need to know what the word is. Like you need to have that word in your oral vocabulary in order to check it and see if you've gotten it correct. And if you don't have it, then you can't do that final checking step. So I'm running out of time, so I can't go through everything. So I have too much data here, but I thought that was interesting. We could also saw significant differences in sight word recognition, and also, but even bigger differences in phonemic decoding. And really big differences in ORF. This is where, like, I would say the biggest difference showed up. Kids who are below the decoding threshold, even though they can read a lot of words, are reading almost 45 words slower per minute than kids above the decoding threshold. That is a huge experiential difference. If you think about what it's like to be a kid in school trying to finish your homework, every single minute you're falling further and further behind your peers. All of your homework takes longer. It's very frustrating, and it's hard to get to that level of immersion and comprehension that we were talking about earlier. And notice there's a huge difference in accuracy too, right? They're making about four, 3 to 4 more mistakes per minute as well. They're having more difficulty with words that they're reading, which of course slows you down and interferes with your comprehension. And same thing with the test of silent reading efficiency and comprehension. This is a test of sentences and whether or not how quickly they can read and comprehend sentences. And kids below the coding threshold comprehend about 5 fewer sentences accurately per minute than kids above the decoding threshold. So even though we're not seeing huge gaps in their word knowledge, we're seeing that those gaps translate into really big differences in fluency and comprehension very quickly. And this was my saddest slide when we asked them questions about how motivated they were to read nonfiction, because our project is focused on nonfiction, on reading informational text. They had no differences between the two groups on how much they valued reading nonfiction, but big differences on how good they thought they were at it. So the self-concept for kids below the decoding threshold. So this sort of struggle is impacting kids' reading self-concept and making them feel like they can't do it or that they're not good readers. And so then I ran some tests to see what were the best predictors of status at the end of 5th grade, of being above and below the decoding threshold. And the ability to decode non-words and your ORF were the 2 biggest predictors that distinguish the 2 groups. So that's so the ability to tackle new hard words and how many words you can read automatically. So now we get to step 3, which is interpret this data in terms of the theories and what we know about reading development. What phase do you think these kids are in? And when we think of Aries phases, have they looked at all that looked across data sources? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oops. All right. To answer a question, so hold on. Let's see if I can get this here. I believe that they are in the consolidated alphabetic phase. So, because they are able to read most single syllable words and familiar high frequency 2-syllable words. They are able to read almost all compound words. So we know they are able to use chunks and multi-letter patterns, that they have a lexicon of words, that they are able to use those vowel teams, right? But they are not able to consistently analogize from the words that they know to other words, and they're not able to efficiently use all the different patterns and chunks to read long words. So they're still in this phase where they need to help. They don't need to go back to very beginning phonics instruction, but they need help to get through this phase. And in my recent research, I've discovered that a lot of kids get stuck in this phase and they just do not make progress towards those more complex words. And we think about where is the coding threshold? I was sort of positing that it might be between first 1 and 2 syllable words or between 2 and 3 syllable words. It's actually it's a little bit more complex, right? It's between easy 2-syllable words and harder 2-syllable words. And so they're able to read high frequency 2-syllable words, but they need help with these unusual vocabulary words and words that have these ambiguous spelling patterns. And this is as somebody else pointed out, this is a vocabulary test. So this brings us back to the lexical quality hypothesis. It's not just about recognizing the letter patterns and being able to use them to decode words. It's about connecting that to vocabulary knowledge. That brings us to our last step, step 4, which is identify evidence-based practices that can address the needs. Don't get distracted by what the test is actually testing. Should I spend a lot of time teaching kids to identify pseudo-homophones? No, I'm not going to do that, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the IES practice guide. I think we might be able to put that link in the chat. But basically, or What Works Clearinghouse, and I'm going to figure out what are the evidence-based practices for addressing these types of needs. In particular, this practice guide, which I highly recommend, it recommends instruction in useful word parts, particularly morphemes, because those can help you with decoding, especially prefixes and suffixes, but also with with new vocabulary, right? Figuring out what those new words mean when you encounter them in text. Then teaching kids a routine and lots of practice, giving lots of practice and encouragement to figure out those new words when they approach them in text. Don't just give up or skip it, but actually spend time to look at the word parts and figure it out. And then support for learning the meaning of the new words and developing content area vocabulary as they're reading. And then finally, lots and lots of opportunities to read with support, including fluency support. So there's lots of great evidence-based practices in that guide for diving in deeper. But basically, this is whenever you have an assessment data, you can go through these steps, look across data, and try to figure out what it is that this assessment is telling you your kids need. If you're interested in more information, there are QR codes that link to the studies that I've published based on this data, and we'll be sending out these slides later, so you don't need to capture those QR codes or links or anything now. Everything will be available in the PowerPoint. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you, Dr. Tortorelli. That was amazing. I just want to say, as we jump into a new year, your 4 principles for using assessment data will be super helpful. I know that I'm already thinking about how I can apply those thoughts and those questions to vowels, which I think across the board, especially with our upper grades, that because it's just now we're going into 4 through 8 with using vowels. And so we'll be thinking about those subtests within that. So in addition, the decoding threshold is something that we can share with our educators. I'm going to take it back to my building and talk about and stress the importance of that decoding work earlier grades. And I know what was most surprising to me, well, although if I thought about it more, I probably would have caught it, but that those students that are not meeting that, they're below the coding threshold, excuse me, are still able to read those compound words and those words with the first syllable closed. So it may not be the most obvious students that are sticking out to us. So on a personal level, I do want to say I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing from another Culpeper local. So thank you so much for spending the evening with us. All right. So
I do want to say that I guess one of the messages I want to take away is that diving deeper into assessments can be asset-based, right? It's not just about identifying deficits, about identifying what they can do. Someone asked about the early grades. There's an IES practice guide for that too. And so I just put the link in. Sorry, I'll be quiet
Oh,
now.
no, that's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, asset based for sure. That's going to have value in looking at it that way. So yeah, and I just wanted to pass this on to Kathleen Murrah, who is representing Just Right Reader, our sponsor for this event. And also we'll dive more into it in our September event, but they have sponsored us for membership this year. So we are so grateful for Just Right Reader and our partnership.
We're happy to partner with you guys. I'll be fast. I know we're at the end of our session. I'm Kathleen Murr with Just Right Reader. Excited to be here today. Just Right Reader was founded a little over 3 years ago by our CEO and founder, Sarah Rich. She was a turnaround principal for over 20 years, and her own daughter started struggling with reading, and it was very eye-opening to her. And she went to her school library and was trying to find resources, and she realized that there weren't enough quality, engaging decodables out there. So Just Right Reader was born. She started emailing researchers, and guess what? They actually emailed her back. And so right now we have over 30 million books delivered in that short time frame and work with over 3,000 school districts. And the best part about our books is that they are all at least 90% decodable. So And the researchers, these are just some of the researchers: Heidi M. Mesmer from Virginia Tech, Lucy Hart Paulson, co-author of Letters. So we work with a lot of great minds, and we know how important it is to have VDOE approved resources. So we are on your supplemental VDOE approved list. So just wanted to throw that out there. And we know how important the Virginia Literacy Act is. We know that early literacy remains an area of focus in Virginia. And we are a supplement. So we have two different products. We have classroom libraries, and we have our Take Everywhere literacy packs. And I'll dig into both of these briefly, but we're a supplement. So we align to your curriculum. We know that teachers have limited time. So we do our best to partner with you and work with the materials you're already using in your core. So this is just an example of some of those alignments. Our secret sauce, the thing I love most about our decodable readers, is the QR code. I think that is, the best part. It really strengthens family engagement. The QR code is on the back of the book. You just scan that code, and there's a 2 to 3 minute phonics video that's there. So teachers can utilize that, parents can utilize that, and we continue to create more and more languages because it's requested by our districts. Our districts are dealing with parents from all of these other places, and so we actually have the videos in all of these different languages and continue to add all the time. The other part about our decodables are, when you open it up at the very beginning on the front page, the phonics skill is located there. First and foremost, new vocabulary. And on the back page, there's phonics activities that are included with each text. One of the things also that I forgot to mention is that very intentionally, we put all the words on one side of the page and the images on the other. So the teacher can actually fold that book over, let the students actually focus on that text, but we also want them to be engaging. So we want that, the illustrations to be there as well. We have pre-emergent library all the way up to second grade library. And then for those older kids, we have our high interest chapter book library. So you can see we have created so many titles, and those titles are available in English and in Spanish. The Take Everywhere packs are my favorite. Personally, I love these because they're different. Students have their own little backpack. There's a QR code that can be a special message, maybe from your superintendent, talking about the importance of literacy, or maybe even the building principle. Students, we use your VALS data in Virginia, and you can customize them with that data, and students get their own pack. It looks like a little present with 10 decodable readers in there, and they can take them home. And we know the importance of getting good books in the students' home so that they can continue to practice and reinforce what's being taught in school. And they also we've included writing pages as well. And again, it includes that video lesson so parents can help. So many times we know that students go home and parents ask what they did all day, and they say, nothing, or I don't remember. Well, this is a way for parents to become involved with their students' learning. We have districts that do take-home packs throughout the year for certain groups. I'm working with a district right now that's buying 5 packs, Virginia District, for their students who on the VALS test have, I forget what they call it, high, they're struggling readers. So they're doing 5 packs for those kids. They'll go out throughout the year. And then sometimes districts buy these packs for summer packs to encourage summer reading, or maybe packs to go home during school breaks, and also during tutoring, for high dosage tutoring. And then, of course, we have all of the support for your teachers, lesson plans for every one of our decodables, tips for administrators, and then, of course, that parent support, because we really want to strengthen that family engagement. And then, of course, we want these to be stories that every student will love, and we want them to see themselves in these books. So we've worked really hard to do that. So if you would like a sample, I can send you a sample packet. It has samples of all the different decodables. You can go to our website, justwritereader.com, and then if you're in Virginia, I noticed a couple other states there, but Virginia, you can go to state partnerships and click on that. It'll take you right to our Virginia specific landing page. So you can go there, or on the main page, you click on resources and it will ask you if you would like a sample, and you can just fill that out and we will get that pack right out to you. And that's it.
Okay, thank you so much from our sponsor. Speaking of our sponsor, we want to give a special thanks to Just Right Reader. And they have, if you are enjoying these sessions and everything we have to come this fall, that is due to your membership here with the Reading League Virginia. If you're not a member, thanks to Just Right Reader, this year it is free. They are sponsoring memberships for educators across the state, and we are appreciative of that. As a follow-up to this session, you will get a link if you would like to become a member of the Reading League Virginia. You'll have access to be able to do that. And if you'd like to get even more involved in the work that we do and we take so personally, by becoming an ambassador within your region, we're always looking to spread our mission throughout the state of Virginia. So please feel free to join us. There'll be a link in the follow-up email for you to be able to join us and take advantage of everything being a member of the Reading League of Virginia has to offer. You can also get some swag. We'll send that link out as well. Enjoy representing our organization across the state. And we truly thank you for joining us tonight. Dr. Tortorelli did an amazing job on a topic that's very, very relatable to us in the district. So it is important for you to continue watching these types of events as we go throughout the fall. There'll be more sessions that will help you connect to our mission. Thank you so much. If you want to get involved, you can email us at info@va.thereadingleague.org. Also, if you want a PD certificate for this session, we are now offering PD certificates for these amazing sessions. So not only do you get information, you get some PD points to go with it. Very important, you are only getting your PD certificate through the link offered here. So I'm putting it in the chat right now, and it is on the screen. Feel free to fill out that form and download your PD certificate. Thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful week.